There's a specific kind of pain that doesn't come from failure. It comes from something far more subtle, far more crushing. It's the moment when you finally gather the courage to speak your truth, to share the vision that's been burning inside you for months, maybe years, and you watch the light fade from someone's eyes as they smile politely and say, "That's interesting." You know that look. The one that says they're already planning how to change the subject. The one that tells you they've categorized your dream as unrealistic before you've even finished explaining it. And in that moment, you realize something that will either break you or forge you into someone unrecognizable. You're completely alone in this, not because people don't care about you, but because they simply cannot see what you see. And the question that will determine everything about your future is this: will you let their blindness convince you that your vision doesn't exist? Or will you learn to walk forward in the dark, building something they won't believe in until it's already standing right in front of them? If you've ever felt this, you already know it's one of the loneliest experiences in existence. Not the loneliness of physical isolation, but the loneliness of carrying a dream that lives only in your mind. You can be surrounded by people who love you, people who genuinely want the best for you, and still feel completely isolated when it comes to the thing that matters most. I want to tell you about someone named Sophia. A few years ago, Sophia was working as a project coordinator for a mid-sized logistics company in Denver. On paper, her life looked stable, even enviable. Good salary, benefits, a clear career trajectory. Her family was proud. Her friends thought she had it figured out. But Sophia had a secret that was slowly eating away at her sense of purpose. She wanted to become a voice actor, not as a hobby, not as a side interest. She wanted to build an actual career bringing characters to life, narrating audiobooks, voicing commercials and animations. For 3 years, she had been taking classes at night, practicing accents in her car during lunch breaks, recording samples in a makeshift studio she'd built in her closet, using moving blankets and foam panels. She studied the craft obsessively, analyzing performances, learning breathing techniques, understanding the technical side of audio production. But she hadn't told anyone, not her parents, not her colleagues, not even her closest friends, because deep down, she already knew what would happen when she did. Then one evening, during a family dinner at her sister's house, the conversation turned to future plans. Her brother-in-law mentioned he was thinking about getting his real estate license. Everyone nodded approvingly. Her sister talked about maybe going back to school for a nursing degree. More nods, supportive questions, encouragement all around. Sophia felt the words forming before she could stop them. "I've been thinking about leaving my job to pursue voice acting full time." The silence that followed felt like it lasted an hour. It was probably only 3 seconds, but those 3 seconds contained entire conversations, confusion, concern, the mental calculation of whether this was a joke. Her mother spoke first, her voice careful, measured. "Voice acting? Like cartoons?" "Not just cartoons," Sophia explained, feeling her confidence already starting to waver. "Audiobooks, commercials, video games, documentaries. It's actually a growing industry, and I've been training seriously for—" "But you have such a good job," her father interrupted, not unkindly. "Why would you risk that for something so uncertain?" Her sister leaned forward, trying to be supportive. Maybe you could do it on the side. Keep the stability of your current position while you explore this. The conversation moved on quickly after that. Someone changed the subject to something safer, something that didn't require anyone to imagine Sophia as anything other than who they already understood her to be. And Sophia sat there, feeling something she had never quite felt before, the weight of being completely misunderstood by people who loved her. This is where most dreams begin to die, not in dramatic explosions of failure, but in quiet moments of polite dismissal. When the people closest to you look at your vision and see only risk. When they hear your excitement and respond with caution. When they love you enough to want to protect you from disappointment, but not enough to believe you might actually succeed. What Sophia didn't realize yet, what most people don't realize at this stage, is that this moment of isolation isn't a sign that the dream is wrong. It's actually the first real test of whether the dream is truly yours. Think about it this way. When you share an idea that fits neatly into what people already expect from you, they celebrate it easily. A teacher pursuing a master's degree in education? Wonderful. An accountant studying for a higher certification? Makes perfect sense. But the moment you step outside the boundaries of who people have decided you are, you enter territory that makes them uncomfortable. Not because they don't want you to grow, but because growth requires them to see you differently. And seeing someone differently requires effort, imagination, and a willingness to be wrong about who they thought you were. Most people aren't willing to do that work, so instead they protect their existing understanding of you by treating your new vision as temporary confusion. A phase, something you'll outgrow once you get realistic. The psychological term for this is called the expectancy effect. People around you have built mental models of who you are based on your past behavior, your previous choices, your current circumstances. These models help them navigate their relationship with you efficiently. They don't have to constantly reevaluate who you are because they've already categorized you. But when you announce a dramatic change, you're essentially asking them to delete their existing model and build a new one. That requires cognitive effort. It creates uncertainty, and the human brain despises uncertainty. So instead of updating their understanding of you, they unconsciously try to pull you back into alignment with their existing model. They do this through skepticism, through practical concerns, through loving warnings disguised as wisdom. And because these responses come from people you trust, they carry enormous weight. Sophia experienced this weight for weeks after that family dinner. Every day at her logistics job felt heavier. She would sit in meetings about shipping routes and inventory management, and her mind would drift to the voice acting script she had been practicing the night before. She felt split in half. One version of her showing up to an office, fulfilling expectations, staying safe. Another version of her trapped inside, screaming to be released. But something interesting started happening during those weeks of internal conflict. The more Sophia sat with her dream in private, the clearer it became that it wasn't going away. She had hoped that sharing it would create momentum, that external encouragement would give her the courage to move forward. But what she discovered instead was something far more valuable. The dream didn't need external validation to be real. It was already real. It existed in the hours she spent practicing. It existed in the way her heart raced when she nailed a difficult emotional read. It existed in the recordings saved on her laptop, the skills she had quietly developed, the vision she could see even when no one else could. This realization marked a turning point. Sophia stopped waiting for permission. She stopped hoping someone would tell her it was okay to pursue this. Instead, she started asking herself a different question. What would I do if I already believed this was possible? The answer was immediate. She would commit fully. She would stop treating voice acting like a secret hobby and start treating it like a legitimate career path. She would invest in better equipment, create a professional demo reel, reach out to agents, audition for real projects. So she did. Not because anyone encouraged her, not because the path became clear, but because the alternative, continuing to live split in half, had become unbearable. She gave her notice at the logistics company 3 months after that family dinner. The reactions were predictable. Her manager was surprised. Her colleagues thought she was brave, which is often what people say when they think you're being foolish, but don't want to say it directly. Her family remained quietly concerned, offering support laced with gentle suggestions that she could always come back if things don't work out. But here's what nobody saw. In the 3 months between that family dinner and her resignation, Sophia had already changed. She had stopped measuring her progress by other people's reactions and started measuring it by her own development. She had completed an advanced voice acting intensive. She had recorded a professional demo that showcased range across multiple genres. She had researched the industry thoroughly, understanding market rates, networking strategies, and realistic timelines for building a client base. By the time she left her job, she wasn't leaping blindly into uncertainty. She was stepping deliberately onto a path she had already begun building, one careful decision at a time. This is the part of success stories that almost never gets told. The invisible preparation phase. The months or years when someone is working towards something that exists only in their own mind. From the outside, it looks like sudden change. From the inside, it's the culmination of countless small choices made in private, long before anyone else was paying attention. Sophia's first 6 months as a full-time voice actor were exactly as difficult as everyone had warned her they would be. She auditioned constantly. Most auditions led nowhere. She booked small jobs, narrating training videos for corporate clients, voicing characters for low-budget indie games, recording samples for audio producers building their portfolios. The work was inconsistent. Some weeks she made decent money. Other weeks she made almost nothing. But something crucial was happening beneath the surface of those difficult months. She was building skills that only come from real-world experience. She was learning how to audition effectively, how to take direction, how to deliver professional quality work under deadline pressure. She was developing relationships with producers and directors who would remember her for future projects. She was creating a body of work that proved her capabilities far more effectively than any explanation ever could. And slowly, almost imperceptibly at first, the skepticism around her began to shift. Not because she convinced anyone with words, but because results started speaking for themselves. Her family stopped asking when she was going to look for a real job and started asking what projects she was working on. Friends who had smiled politely when she first mentioned voice acting began referring potential clients to her. The narrative around her shifted from Sophia who quit her job for a risky dream to Sophia who's building a voice-acting career. But here's the critical insight. That shift in external perception only happened because Sophia had already shifted internally. She had stopped waiting for belief to come from outside and started generating it from within. She had learned to walk forward without applause, to improve without immediate validation, to trust her own assessment of progress even when others couldn't see it yet. This pattern appears in almost every meaningful success story, though the details change. Someone has a vision that exists only in their mind. They share it and encounter skepticism, sometimes gentle, sometimes harsh. They face a choice: abandon the vision to restore comfort with the people around them, or continue building it despite the absence of external support. The people who eventually succeed are the ones who choose to continue, not because they're more talented, not because they have some special advantage, but because they develop the capacity to believe in something before the evidence appears. They learn to hold their vision steady while the world around them suggests they're being unrealistic. If you're reading this right now and you recognize yourself in Sophia's story, if you're carrying a dream that feels lonely because nobody around you seems to understand it, I want you to consider something important. The absence of external belief is not evidence that your vision is wrong. It's simply evidence that your vision is new. It exists in territory that the people around you haven't explored yet. They're not rejecting you. They're reacting to unfamiliarity. And unfamiliarity always triggers caution in the human mind. Your task right now isn't to convince them. Your task is to build enough evidence through consistent action that eventually belief becomes inevitable, not because you argued for it, but because you demonstrated it. Every expert was once a beginner working in obscurity. Every successful business was once an untested idea that most people dismissed. Every breakthrough started as a vision that lived in only one person's mind. The question isn't whether your dream deserves external validation right now. The question is whether you're willing to keep building it during the period when that validation hasn't arrived yet. Because once you develop the ability to move forward without waiting for approval, you unlock something incredibly powerful. You stop being dependent on other people's limited imagination. You stop needing permission to become who you're capable of becoming. And you discover that the most important belief you'll ever receive doesn't come from the crowd around you. It comes from the person staring back at you in the mirror, deciding each morning whether to continue or quit. And when that person chooses to continue day after day, despite the silence, despite the doubt, despite the loneliness of walking a path that nobody else can see yet, something remarkable begins to take shape. Not overnight, not with fanfare, but quietly, steadily, inevitably. The dream that once existed only in your mind starts becoming visible in the world. And the belief you once hoped to receive from others becomes something you no longer need, because you've already built it yourself, one difficult choice at a time. Section 2. When doubt becomes your companion, the hardest battle you'll ever fight isn't against the people who don't believe in you. It's against the version of their doubt that eventually moves into your own head and starts speaking in your voice. This is the stage that breaks most people, not the initial skepticism from others, not the practical challenges of starting something new, but the slow, insidious process where external questions become internal convictions, where "are you sure that's realistic?" transforms into "I'm probably not cut out for this," where other people's caution becomes your own certainty that you're wasting your time. I want to tell you about James because his story illustrates this psychological shift with painful clarity. James was a high school history teacher in Portland for nearly 8 years. He was good at his job, well liked by students, respected by colleagues. But James had spent those 8 years harboring a dream that felt increasingly urgent as he approached his mid-30s. He wanted to build custom furniture, specifically designing and crafting heirloom-quality wooden pieces using traditional joinery techniques. This wasn't a passing interest. Since college, James had been teaching himself woodworking. He spent weekends in a small workshop space he rented on the outskirts of the city. He studied master craftsmen, practiced dovetail joints until his hands ached, learned to read wood grain like a language. Over the years, he had created maybe 20 pieces, beautiful tables, chairs, cabinets, each one more refined than the last. Friends and family owned most of them, given as gifts for weddings and housewarmings. But James had started wondering, what if this wasn't just a hobby? What if he could actually build a business creating custom furniture for people who valued craftsmanship over mass production? The idea terrified and excited him in equal measure. When he finally mentioned it to his partner Claire, during a long drive back from visiting her parents, her response was gentle but firm. Woodworking is your escape from the stress of teaching. If you turn it into a business, won't it just become another source of pressure? And honestly, can people really make a living at that anymore? Everything's IKEA now. He brought it up with his department head over coffee one afternoon, framing it carefully as a hypothetical. Ever think about leaving teaching to do something completely different? His colleague laughed, not unkindly. Every teacher thinks about that, usually around February when the budget cuts are announced and the students are at their worst. But then summer comes, you remember why you started, and the feeling passes. This job has a pension, James, and health care. You'd be walking away from real security. James's older brother, a successful real estate developer, was even more direct. Look, I admire the craftsmanship, I really do. But you're talking about a market that barely exists. Rich people buy designer furniture from Italy. Everyone else goes to a furniture store. Where's your customer base? How are you planning to scale? Because if you can't scale, you don't have a business. You have an expensive hobby. Each conversation added weight. Not because these people were cruel, they genuinely cared about James, but because their logic made sense. Their concerns were rational. Their caution was reasonable. And reasonable doubt is far more dangerous than obvious criticism, because you can't dismiss it as ignorance. You have to wrestle with it seriously. So James wrestled. For months, the internal dialogue became exhausting. He would spend Saturday mornings in his workshop, carefully shaping a piece of walnut, feeling completely at peace. Then Monday would arrive. He'd be back in the classroom, teaching the causes of the French Revolution, and a thought would slide into his mind. You're 34 years old, If this furniture thing was going to work, wouldn't it have happened by now? He'd scroll through Instagram at night, looking at established furniture makers with tens of thousands of followers, stunning workshop spaces, waiting lists for their pieces. The comparison was crushing. They started young, he told himself. They had financial backing. They knew the right people. I'm too late, too undercapitalized, too unknown. The voice grew louder, more articulate, more convincing. Claire is right. This is your stress relief. Don't ruin it by adding financial pressure. Your brother understands business. You don't. You're a teacher who likes working with wood. That doesn't make you an entrepreneur. What if you quit your job and fail? You'll have given up security, disappointed everyone who cares about you, and proven that you should have just stayed in your lane. This is the dangerous territory where dreams go to die quietly, not in explosive failure, but in the slow suffocation of internal doubt that masquerades as wisdom, maturity, or realistic thinking. Here's what makes this stage so psychologically devastating. The doubt feels like it's coming from you. It sounds like your voice. It uses your vocabulary. It references your actual fears and insecurities. So you trust it. You treat it as honest self-assessment, rather than recognizing it for what it actually is. Internalized fear wearing the mask of rationality. Psychologists call this borrowed belief. You absorb the perspectives of people around you, especially people you respect, and their caution becomes your ceiling. Their inability to imagine your success becomes your inability to imagine it. Not because you lack capability, but because you've unconsciously adopted their limitations as your own. James spent nearly a year trapped in this cycle. He kept teaching. He kept woodworking on weekends, but the joy had leaked out of both activities. Teaching felt like safety he resented. Woodworking felt like a dream he was too afraid to chase. He existed in a kind of suspended animation, committed to neither path fully, waiting for some external sign that never came. Then something unexpected happened. One of James's former students, a young woman named Priya, who had graduated 5 years earlier, reached out via email. She was getting married and wanted to commission a dining table as a wedding gift to herself and her future husband. She had remembered the desk James had built for the school library years ago and wondered if he took private commissions. James almost said no. The self-doubt was immediate. You're not a professional furniture maker. You don't have a business set up. What if you mess it up? What if it takes you too long? What if she's disappointed? But something else spoke up, quieter, but more insistent. What if you say yes? He said yes. The project took him 3 months of weekends and evenings. He worked with cherry wood, designing a table that could seat 8 comfortably, with clean lines and hand-cut mortise and tenon joints. He obsessed over every detail, the way the grain flowed, the smoothness of the finish, the stability of the structure. When Priya and her fiancé came to pick up the table, their reaction was immediate and genuine. They ran their hands over the surface, crouched down to examine the joinery, asked questions about the wood selection and construction process. Priya's fiancé, who worked in tech, said something that stuck with James. This is going to outlive us. Our grandchildren will eat at this table. You can't buy that at a store. They paid him $2,200, more than James had expected to ask for, and they asked if he had a website or Instagram where they could see more of his work and refer friends. He didn't. But that night, he created both. That single project shifted something fundamental, not because it made James rich or famous. It was one table, but because it provided evidence that contradicted the narrative of doubt. Someone had valued his work enough to pay real money for it. Someone had seen quality worth recommending to others. The thing he had been told was unmarketable had just been marketed successfully. The internal voice of doubt didn't disappear. That's not how it works. But its authority weakened, because now, when it said, "Nobody will pay for custom furniture," James had concrete evidence to the contrary. When it said, "You're not good enough to do this professionally," he could point to a table sitting in someone's home that proved otherwise. This is the critical pattern to understand. Doubt doesn't vanish because you become more confident. It weakens because you accumulate evidence that makes it less credible. Think of internal doubt like a prosecuting attorney building a case against you. It presents argument after argument why you should give up, stay safe, avoid risk. Each argument sounds convincing in isolation, but the moment you start presenting counter-evidence, actual results from actual effort, the case begins to fall apart. The doubt is still there, still making its arguments, but you're no longer the jury that automatically believes it. Over the next 6 months, James took on 3 more furniture commissions. Each one came through word of mouth. Each one taught him something new about the business side of custom work. How to price accurately, how to manage client expectations, how to timeline projects realistically. None of these projects made him wealthy. Combined, they brought in maybe $8,000. But they did something far more valuable than generate income. They proved the concept to himself. And slowly, the question changed. It was no longer, "Should I do this?" It became, "How do I do this sustainably?" That shift from whether to how marked the moment when doubt lost its power to paralyze him. James didn't quit teaching immediately. That's important to note. He didn't make some dramatic leap. Instead, he started building a bridge between where he was and where he wanted to be. He reduced his teaching to part-time. He used the freed-up days to take on more furniture projects, build his portfolio, develop relationships with interior designers who might refer clients. The doubt still visited. Every time he encountered a setback, a project that ran over budget, a client who wasn't satisfied with a first design, a week where no new inquiries came in, the old voice would return. "See? This isn't sustainable. You should go back to full-time teaching while you still can." But James had learned something crucial by this point. He had learned to distinguish between doubt as useful caution and doubt as fear disguised as wisdom. Useful doubt asks practical questions. How can I improve this joint? How can I streamline my process? How do I reach more potential clients? Fear disguised as wisdom made sweeping pronouncements. This will never work. You're not cut out for entrepreneurship. You're putting your financial security at risk for a fantasy. The difference is actionability. Useful doubt points toward specific problems you can solve. Fear disguised as wisdom tries to convince you the entire endeavor is flawed. Once James understood this distinction, he could engage with doubt more productively. When it raised a legitimate concern, he addressed it. When it spiraled into catastrophic thinking, He recognized it as noise and returned to the work. 2 years after building that first commissioned table for Priya, James left teaching entirely. By that point, he had a 6-month waiting list for custom pieces, relationships with 3 interior design firms who regularly referred clients, and a pricing structure that actually reflected the value of his craftsmanship. His workshop had expanded to a proper studio space with professional equipment. But here's what nobody saw: the 2 years of internal warfare that preceded that success, the hundreds of conversations with the voice of doubt, the nights lying awake wondering if he was making a catastrophic mistake, the moments of genuine uncertainty about whether the path would work out. External success looks clean in retrospect. A decision was made, risk was taken, success followed. But the internal experience is far messier. It's filled with doubt, backtracking, uncertainty, and the constant temptation to return to safety. If you're currently in that messy middle, if you're wrestling with the voice in your head that keeps suggesting you should give up, I want you to understand something important. That voice is not delivering truth. It's delivering fear. And fear's primary job is to keep you safe, not to help you grow. Fear is a terrible strategic advisor. It sees threats everywhere. It interprets uncertainty as danger. It would rather have you stay small and secure than risk becoming larger and more capable. So when fear starts sounding like reasonable self-assessment, you have to question whose interests it's really serving. The way forward isn't to eliminate doubt. That's impossible. The way forward is to stop letting doubt make your decisions. You acknowledge it, you evaluate whether it's raising legitimate concerns, and then you act anyway. You take the next small step despite the uncertainty. You continue building evidence that gradually makes the doubt less credible. Because here's the truth that most people discover too late: the voice of doubt only has as much power as you give it. It can argue. It can present compelling cases. It can sound exactly like wisdom. But it cannot actually stop you from taking action. Only you can do that. And every time you act despite the doubt, every time you take one more step on the path, even while uncertainty screams at you to turn back, you prove something essential. The doubt was wrong about your capacity to continue. And if it was wrong about that, maybe, just maybe, it's wrong about everything else too. 1952, Section 3, The Invisible Architecture of Progress. There's a peculiar frustration that accompanies the early stages of any worthwhile pursuit. You work intensely. You sacrifice leisure time. You pour energy into something that matters deeply to you, and yet, when someone asks, "How's it going?" you struggle to point to anything that looks impressive. The gap between effort invested and visible results can feel enormous, almost insulting. You know you're working hard. You know you're improving. But proving it to anyone else, or even to yourself on difficult days, feels nearly impossible. This disconnect reveals something most people misunderstand about progress. The most important growth happens underground, invisible to everyone, including yourself, until suddenly it breaks through the surface and everyone acts surprised by the overnight success that actually took years to construct. Let me tell you about Kenji, because his journey maps this invisible phase with remarkable precision. Kenji worked as a software quality assurance tester for a mid-sized tech company in Austin. The job was fine, stable, reasonably well paid. But Kenji had become increasingly fascinated by a different aspect of the industry: podcast production and audio storytelling. Not the celebrity interview format that saturated the market, but narrative investigative podcasts that explored overlooked stories, local history, forgotten communities, cultural shifts happening beneath the surface of mainstream awareness. He had started listening to shows like these during his commute, and somewhere along the way, a thought took root. I could create something like this about Austin, about the communities and stories that get ignored when everyone focuses on the tech boom and the gentrification headlines. So Kenji started researching, not creating yet, just researching. He studied podcast production, sound design, narrative structure, interview techniques. He invested in basic recording equipment, a decent microphone, headphones, editing software. He practiced by recording himself, cringing at the sound of his own voice, gradually learning to speak more naturally, to edit out filler words, to create smooth transitions between segments. For 6 months, nobody knew he was doing any of this. Not his colleagues, not his friends, barely even his roommate, who occasionally heard him recording in his bedroom and probably assumed he was on video calls. This is the stage where most dreams exist in secret, too fragile to expose to outside scrutiny, too uncertain to defend against skeptical questions. Kenji wasn't hiding his interest out of shame. He was protecting something delicate in its early formation, giving it space to develop before subjecting it to evaluation. Then he started actually producing. His first podcast episode took him nearly 2 months to complete. It was a 28-minute piece about the history of a East Austin community center that had served as an anchor for Black and Latino families through decades of neighborhood change. He interviewed longtime residents, dug through archival photos, wove together personal narratives with historical context. When he finally published it, uploading it to a podcast hosting platform with zero promotional budget or existing audience, the response was minimal. 17 downloads in the first week. Most of those were probably Kenji himself, checking repeatedly to make sure it had uploaded correctly. 17 downloads after 2 months of work. The math was brutal. If he valued his time at even minimum wage, he had worked for roughly 5 cents per listener. Any rational business analysis would have concluded this is unsustainable. Abandon immediately. But something interesting happens when you measure progress solely by external metrics like downloads or revenue. You miss the invisible architecture being constructed beneath the surface. Because while Kenji's first episode only reached 17 people, something far more valuable had occurred. He had learned how to take a story from concept to completion. He had developed an interview style that made people comfortable sharing personal histories. He had figured out his editing workflow, discovered which software tools worked best for his process, made mistakes, and corrected them. He had transformed from someone who consumed podcasts into someone who produced them. None of that learning was visible in the download numbers, but all of it was essential foundation for everything that would follow. Kenji created a second episode. This one took only 5 weeks, nearly twice as fast as the first. It explored the evolution of Austin's food truck culture through the perspective of a family-run taco truck that had operated in the same location for 15 years. 31 downloads in the first week. Progress, technically, but still nowhere near sustainable. Third episode, 3.5 weeks to produce. A story about a music venue that had survived multiple near closures and become a cultural touchpoint for Austin's underground music scene. 47 downloads. Fourth episode, 3 weeks. The informal network of urban gardeners transforming vacant lots into community green spaces. 63 downloads. Do you see what's happening? The audience growth was modest, almost imperceptible, but the production timeline was accelerating significantly. What initially took 2 months now took 3 weeks. The quality was improving, his interview technique sharper, his editing more sophisticated, his narrative structure more compelling. He was getting better at the craft itself, regardless of whether large numbers of people were noticing yet. This is the compound effect that most people abandon before it can reveal its power. Small improvements, repeated consistently over time, create exponential rather than linear growth. But the exponential curve has a deceptive shape. It looks almost flat at the beginning, so flat that it's easy to conclude nothing is happening. Only later does the curve shoot upward in a way that seems sudden to outside observers, but is actually the inevitable result of accumulated small gains. Neuroscientists have discovered something fascinating about skill acquisition that directly relates to this invisible growth phase. When you're learning something new, your brain is forming new neural pathways, strengthening connections between regions that previously didn't communicate efficiently. This process, called myelination, happens gradually. You can't feel it occurring. You can't measure it day by day. But it's fundamentally changing your brain's capacity to perform the skill. The frustrating part is that during the early stages of myelination, your performance feels inconsistent. Some days you execute well, other days you feel like you've regressed. This inconsistency isn't evidence of failure. It's evidence of your brain actively rewiring itself. But because the process is invisible and nonlinear, it's easy to interpret the struggle as proof that you're not cut out for this, that you lack natural talent, that you should quit. Kenji experienced this exact pattern. Some episodes came together smoothly. Others required multiple re-recordings, extensive revision, moments where he questioned whether he had any idea what he was doing. But he had made a quiet commitment to himself. Produce 1 episode per month for 1 full year. Not because he was certain it would lead anywhere specific, but because a year felt like enough time to actually learn whether he enjoyed the process independent of results. That commitment, that decision to decouple effort from immediate outcome, created space for something crucial to develop: competence, built through repetition. By episode 8, Kenji's production time had stabilized at around 2 weeks per episode. His audio quality had improved significantly. His interviews had become more focused and revelatory. He had developed a recognizable style, a particular way of weaving historical context with personal narrative that gave his stories emotional resonance without sacrificing journalistic integrity. And the audience was growing slowly, quietly, but consistently. Episode 8 got 140 downloads in its first week. Episode 10 hit 230. Not viral numbers, not enough to quit his day job, but evidence of organic growth. People finding the show, sharing it with friends who cared about Austin's hidden stories, leaving reviews that helped it surface in podcast app algorithms. More importantly, something had shifted in Kenji himself. He no longer needed external validation to confirm that the work mattered. He had found the process itself intrinsically rewarding. The research, the interviews, the careful crafting of narrative, all of it engaged parts of himself that his quality assurance job never touched. The podcast had become less about building an audience and more about creating work he was genuinely proud of. This internal shift is critical. When your motivation depends entirely on external metrics, engagement numbers, follower counts, revenue figures, you become emotionally volatile. Good numbers create euphoria. Bad numbers create despair. You're constantly at the mercy of forces you can't fully control. But when you develop intrinsic motivation, when the work itself becomes the reward, you achieve emotional stability that's essential for long-term persistence. You still care about results, of course. You still want the work to reach people and create impact. But your sense of purpose doesn't collapse when growth is slow or results are delayed. By the end of his first year, Kenji had produced 12 episodes. His average download count per episode had reached around 800 in the first month after release, with numbers continuing to grow as the back catalog attracted new listeners who binged through older episodes. Total audience wasn't massive, maybe 15,000 unique listeners across all episodes, but it was real. These were actual people choosing to spend 30 minutes of their limited attention on stories Kenji had crafted. And then something unexpected happened. A producer from a regional NPR affiliate reached out. She had been listening to Kenji's podcast, impressed by the production quality and the depth of his local storytelling. Her station was developing a new show focused on underreported community stories across Texas, and they needed someone who could produce compelling narrative audio on a consistent deadline. Was Kenji interested in freelancing? The opportunity didn't come from networking events or aggressive self-promotion or paid advertising. It came because Kenji had been consistently creating quality work that slowly found its way to someone in a position to recognize its value. This is how real opportunities typically emerge, not through dramatic breakthroughs or viral moments, but through the quiet accumulation of credible work that eventually reaches a critical threshold of visibility. You can't predict exactly when that threshold will be crossed. You can't force it to happen faster through willpower alone. You can only keep building, keep improving, keep showing up until the invisible work becomes undeniable. Kenji took the freelance opportunity. It didn't require him to quit his full-time job initially, just meant working evenings and weekends were now compensated. But more importantly, it validated something he had come to believe during those 12 months of obscure production work. If you get genuinely good at something valuable, opportunities find you. You don't have to chase them desperately. You just have to be good enough, visible enough, and patient enough for the right connection to eventually occur. 18 months after starting his podcast, Kenji transitioned to working half-time at the tech company and half-time producing for the NPR affiliate. His own podcast continued, now with a modest Patreon bringing in a few $100s per month from listeners who valued the work enough to support it directly. 2 years in, he left the tech job entirely, cobbling together income from the NPR work, his own podcast's support, and occasional freelance audio production for other creators and organizations. But here's what matters most about Kenji's story. None of the later success would have been possible without the invisible early phase. The months where progress looked non-existent, the episodes that barely anyone heard, the skills developed in obscurity, the patience to continue when rational analysis suggested quitting. That invisible phase wasn't wasted time. It was essential construction, the foundation upon which everything else was built. If you're currently in your own invisible phase, working on something that hasn't produced impressive results yet, I want you to consider a different way of measuring progress. Don't ask how many people are noticing. Ask instead, am I better at this than I was 3 months ago? Have I learned things that didn't exist in my understanding before? Am I building skills that will compound over time? If the answer to those questions is yes, you're not stagnating. You're constructing the invisible architecture that visible success will eventually rest upon. The world can't see it yet. Sometimes you can't see it yourself. But it's there, forming, strengthening, preparing to support something remarkable. The people who abandon their pursuits during this phase often do so precisely because they measure progress only by external validation. They need applause to confirm effort is worthwhile. They need immediate results to justify continued investment. And when those external signals don't arrive on their preferred timeline, they conclude the entire endeavor was a mistake. But the people who persist through the invisible phase understand something deeper. They recognize that all meaningful skill development, all substantial creative work, all genuine expertise requires a period of obscurity, not as punishment, not as hazing, but as the natural rhythm of how competence is actually built. You cannot skip the invisible phase. You can only decide whether you're willing to work through it. And that decision, that willingness to continue building when nobody's watching, when results are minimal, when progress feels impossible to demonstrate, that's what eventually separates the people who achieve remarkable things from the people who merely dream about them. 1957, Section 4. The moment belief shifts from external to internal. There comes a point in every meaningful journey when something fundamental changes inside you. Not in your circumstances, not in other people's opinions, but in the way you relate to your own capability. It's the moment when you stop asking the world for permission to believe in yourself and start generating that belief from within, independent of external validation. This shift doesn't announce itself dramatically. There's no ceremony, no clear dividing line. But once it happens, everything about your pursuit changes. Your resilience strengthens. Your focus sharpens. Your emotional stability stops rising and falling with each piece of feedback or criticism. You become, in a very real sense, unstoppable, not because obstacles disappear, but because your commitment no longer depends on circumstances being favorable. Let me introduce you to Amara, whose story illustrates this internal revolution with particular clarity. Amara had worked in corporate marketing for a large beverage company in Chicago for 7 years. She was competent at her job, maybe even talented. She understood brand positioning, campaign analytics, consumer psychology. But somewhere around year 5, a quiet dissatisfaction began growing. The work felt hollow. She was helping a corporation sell more sugar water to people who didn't need it. The creativity she had imagined marketing would provide had been reduced to A/B testing email subject lines and optimizing ad spend across platforms. Meanwhile, Amara had developed a side interest that was consuming more of her mental energy than her actual career. Sustainable fashion, not as a consumer, but as a potential creator. She had become increasingly disturbed by the environmental impact of fast fashion, the exploitative labor conditions, the psychological manipulation of trend cycles designed to make people feel inadequate unless they constantly consume new clothing. She started experimenting with upcycling, taking old garments from thrift stores and transforming them into something fresh and wearable. A vintage men's blazer became a structured crop jacket. Old jeans were reconstructed into patchwork pieces with intentional asymmetry. She wasn't trained in fashion design formally. She was teaching herself through YouTube tutorials, trial and error, and obsessive attention to construction details. For a while, this remained purely personal. She wore her creations, posted occasional photos on Instagram, received compliments from friends, but a question kept surfacing. What if this could be more than a hobby? What if she could build something that actually challenged the fashion industry's destructive patterns while creating beautiful, unique clothing? When Amara first voiced this possibility to her sister during a weekend visit, the response was immediate skepticism wrapped in concern. The fashion industry is notoriously difficult to break into. You don't have formal training, you don't have connections, and honestly, sustainable fashion is a niche market. Most people say they care about ethics until they see the price tag. Her closest friend from college, now a lawyer, was more direct. You have a stable career with benefits and a 401k. Fashion is a gamble, and at 32, you're not exactly in the age range where most designers break through. I just don't want you to sacrifice security for something that statistically probably won't work out. Even Amara's partner Marcus, who was generally supportive, expressed caution. I love that you're passionate about this, but maybe you could keep it as a creative outlet while maintaining your marketing job. Best of both worlds, right? The advice was rational. The concerns were legitimate, and Amara felt the weight of them accumulating, pressing down on the fragile possibility she had been nurturing. For months, she existed in limbo. She kept her marketing job, kept upcycling clothes in her spare time, kept wondering whether she was being wise by staying put or cowardly by not taking the leap. The internal debate was exhausting. Every day felt like a negotiation between the safe path and the uncertain one, between who she was and who she might become. Then something shifted, not through any external event, but through a realization that crystallized one evening while she was working on reconstructing a vintage dress. She was alone in her apartment, music playing, completely absorbed in the process of deconstructing seams and reimagining the garment structure. Hours passed without her noticing, and at some point she looked up and realized this was the only time during her entire week when she felt fully alive, not distracted, not anxious, not performing competence for someone else's benefit, just present, engaged, creating something that mattered to her. The marketing job, for all its stability and prestige, never produced that feeling, not once in 7 years. And in that moment, Amara understood something that would change the entire trajectory of her life. She was already succeeding at the thing that mattered most. She had found work that engaged her completely. The question wasn't whether sustainable fashion design was a realistic career path. The question was whether she could build a life around something she had already proven to herself was meaningful, or whether she would abandon it because other people couldn't see what she saw. This realization marked the beginning of her internal shift. She stopped seeking validation from external sources and started trusting her own assessment. She stopped trying to convince people that sustainable fashion was viable and started focusing on making it viable through her own actions. The change in her approach was subtle but profound. Instead of asking, "Do you think I should do this?" she started asking, "How can I do this intelligently?" Instead of defending her vision to skeptics, she simply stopped discussing it with people who weren't genuinely curious or supportive. She redirected the energy she had been spending on justification toward actual skill development and strategic planning. Amara gave herself a specific timeline and measurable goals. 6 months to build a small collection of upcycled pieces. Create an actual brand identity, not just an Instagram account, but a coherent story about what her work represented and who it served. Research production costs, pricing strategies, potential sales channels. Test the market by actually trying to sell pieces, not to friends out of pity, but to strangers who valued what she was creating. This strategic approach did something important. It transformed a vague dream into a concrete experiment with clear success criteria. She wasn't betting her entire future on a fantasy. She was testing a hypothesis about whether her skills and vision could create something people would actually pay for. She started selling pieces through a local consignment shop that featured work from emerging designers. The first month, nothing sold. The second month, one piece sold, a reconstructed denim jacket with hand-embroidered details. The shop owner said the buyer had specifically mentioned appreciating the craftsmanship and the sustainable approach. One sale, $120 minus the shop's commission. Economically trivial, psychologically transformative, because it wasn't a friend buying out of support. It wasn't family purchasing to be encouraging. It was a stranger who had looked at Amara's work alongside other options and chosen hers based purely on its merit. That single transaction proved something the voices of doubt had insisted was untrue. There were people willing to pay for what she was creating. Amara continued, refining her process, improving her technique, slowly building a small portfolio of work. She started attending local sustainable fashion events, not to network aggressively, but to learn from people further along the path. She connected with other designers who were navigating similar challenges, finding community among people who understood what she was attempting rather than trying to convince skeptics. And crucially, she stopped measuring her progress against other people's timelines or definitions of success. She wasn't trying to become a famous designer overnight or launch a massive brand immediately. She was simply trying to build something sustainable, both environmentally and economically, that aligned with her values and utilized her skills. This internal recalibration, this shift from external validation to internal standards, created remarkable emotional stability. When pieces didn't sell, she didn't spiral into doubt about whether the entire endeavor was foolish. She analyzed why, adjusted her approach, created better work. When people questioned her choices, she no longer felt compelled to defend them. She simply continued building evidence through action. 12 months into her experiment, Amara had created enough momentum that a decision point arrived. Her small collection was generating consistent sales. She had been featured in a local magazine article about sustainable fashion innovators. A boutique in a trendy neighborhood wanted to carry her pieces, but scaling up would require more time than evenings and weekends could provide. She reduced her marketing job to 3 days per week, taking a significant pay cut to free up time for her fashion work. Her sister thought she was being reckless. Her college friend worried about her financial stability. Even Marcus expressed concern about whether the numbers actually made sense. But Amara had reached a place internally where other people's concern, however well-intentioned, no longer had the power to derail her, not because she had become arrogant or dismissive, but because she had built enough direct experience to trust her own judgment. She had evidence that skeptics didn't have: the feeling of deep engagement with meaningful work, the tangible proof of growing demand for what she created, the skills she had developed through persistent practice. This is the essence of the internal shift. You stop being dependent on other people believing in your vision because you've already proven it to yourself through small, repeated demonstrations of capability. Each piece of evidence, each skill acquired, each problem solved, strengthens your internal foundation. And once that foundation is solid, external doubt becomes merely noise rather than a destabilizing force. 2 years after that initial evening realization in her apartment, Amara left her marketing job entirely. By that point, her sustainable fashion work was generating more income than her reduced corporate salary. She had developed relationships with suppliers who provided ethically sourced vintage materials. She had a waiting list of clients who appreciated her particular aesthetic and values. She had been invited to show her work at a regional sustainable fashion showcase. But the external success, while gratifying, wasn't actually the most important transformation. The most important change was internal. Amara had become someone who no longer needed permission from the world to pursue what mattered to her. She had developed the capacity to generate her own belief, maintain her own standards, and persist through challenges without requiring constant reassurance that she was on the right path. Psychologists who study self-determination theory describe this as developing autonomous motivation, the ability to pursue goals based on personal values and intrinsic interest rather than external pressure or validation. People with strong autonomous motivation display remarkable resilience because their commitment doesn't evaporate when outside support disappears or when obstacles arise. This is perhaps the most valuable skill anyone can develop: the ability to believe in your own capability independent of external confirmation. Not blind belief, not delusional confidence, but belief earned through direct experience, through small successes that gradually build a foundation of self-trust. If you're currently in the stage where you're still looking outward for validation, where other people's opinions carry enormous weight, where skepticism from others creates internal doubt, I want you to understand that this is normal. It's the natural starting point. But it doesn't have to be the permanent state. The path forward involves redirecting energy. Less energy spent defending your vision to skeptics. More energy spent building tangible evidence through action. Less concern about whether people believe in what you're doing. More focus on whether you're actually getting better at it through consistent practice. Each small achievement, each skill acquired, each problem solved becomes a brick in the foundation of internal belief. And once you've laid enough bricks, something remarkable happens. You stop needing applause to know your work has value. You stop needing permission to continue pursuing what matters. You become internally validated, not through arrogance, but through earned competence. And that internal validation, that quiet confidence built through repeated demonstration of capability, becomes the most powerful resource you possess. Because it cannot be taken away by criticism. It cannot be diminished by skepticism. It remains steady, even when circumstances are difficult or progress is slow. The world will eventually recognize what you're building, but only after you've already recognized it yourself. Only after you've committed to it fully, not because everyone agreed it was a good idea, but because you trusted your own experience enough to continue despite the absence of universal approval. That shift from external to internal validation is the moment when you stop being someone who dreams about achievement and become someone who actually achieves. Not because the path gets easier, but because you've become strong enough to walk it, regardless of how difficult it remains. 2000, Section 5. When the invisible becomes undeniable. There's a peculiar moment that arrives after months or years of working in obscurity. A moment when the invisible effort you've been pouring into something finally crosses a threshold and becomes visible to the world around you. It doesn't happen all at once. It's not a single dramatic breakthrough. Instead, it's more like watching dawn arrive, imperceptible at first, then gradually, undeniably, the darkness gives way to light. This is the stage where people start noticing, where opportunities begin appearing without you chasing them desperately, where the same people who once questioned your decisions start asking how you made it work. And perhaps most satisfying of all, it's the moment when you realize their recognition, while pleasant, is no longer necessary for you to continue. Because by the time they see what you've built, you've already become someone who doesn't need their belief to sustain your own. Let me tell you about Thomas, because his journey captures this transition with remarkable precision. Thomas had spent 4 years building something that barely anyone understood. He was creating educational content for people learning English as a second language, but not through traditional methods. Instead of grammar drills and vocabulary lists, Thomas was teaching English through storytelling, using carefully crafted narratives at different complexity levels, combined with audio recordings that helped learners develop listening comprehension alongside reading skills. He had started this project while working full-time as an ESL teacher at a language school in Seattle. The job was fine, but Thomas had become frustrated by how disconnected traditional curriculum was from the way people actually acquire language naturally. Research showed that immersion in compelling narratives was far more effective than rote memorization, yet most learning materials were mind-numbingly boring. So Thomas started creating his own materials, short stories at beginner, intermediate, and advanced levels. Each one carefully constructed to use vocabulary and grammar structures appropriate to that level, but with actual plots, real emotional arcs, characters learners might care about. He recorded audio versions in clear, well-paced English. He added comprehension questions that tested understanding without feeling like tedious homework. For the first year, this was purely for his own students. He'd use the materials in class, observe what worked, revise what didn't. His students responded enthusiastically. They actually enjoyed the homework when it involved reading an engaging story rather than completing grammar exercises. Their comprehension improved noticeably faster than students using conventional materials. Thomas started wondering, what if this could reach beyond just his classroom? He built a simple website, posted his stories there for free, added a newsletter sign-up for people who wanted new stories delivered weekly. He wasn't trying to build a business initially. He was simply trying to share something he believed was more effective than what currently existed. The first year, his website attracted maybe 300 email subscribers, mostly his own students, and a few people who had stumbled across his site while searching for English learning resources. The numbers were modest to the point of being almost invisible, but Thomas kept creating one new story per week. Beginner level one week, intermediate the next, advanced the week after, then cycling back. He maintained this rhythm religiously even when subscriber growth was glacial, even when weeks went by without any feedback or engagement. Year 2 brought slow but steady growth. The email list reached 2,000 subscribers. People started leaving comments on stories, sharing how much the approach was helping them. A few language teachers reached out, asking if they could use his materials in their own classrooms. Thomas said yes, asking only that they credit the source. By year 3, something interesting was happening. The subscriber count had crossed 15,000. His stories were being shared in language learning forums and social media groups. Teachers from different countries were incorporating his materials into their curriculum. But perhaps most tellingly, people started asking if he offered paid products, more advanced materials, structured courses, downloadable audio packages. Thomas had been giving everything away for free, partly because he believed language learning resources should be accessible, partly because he hadn't thought about monetization seriously. But the repeated requests made him reconsider, not out of greed, but out of recognition that if people valued the work enough to pay for it, creating paid options might actually allow him to dedicate more time to producing higher quality content. He created a small paid membership tier. For $5 a month, subscribers got access to extended versions of stories with deeper vocabulary analysis, additional audio exercises, and early access to new content. He was nervous about whether anyone would actually pay. Within the first month, 800 people subscribed to the paid tier. 800 people, each paying $5 monthly. $4,000 in recurring revenue. Not enough to quit his teaching job, but enough to prove something important. What he was creating had genuine economic value, not just educational merit. Thomas continued refining his approach. He hired a professional narrator to record some of the audio, improving production quality. He started creating thematic story collections, mystery series for intermediate learners, historical fiction for advanced students. He built a small community forum where learners could discuss stories and practice writing in English. By year 4, his email list had reached 45,000 subscribers. The paid membership had grown to over 3,000 people. He had published 2 physical books of his stories through Amazon's print-on-demand service, which were selling steadily. Total revenue from all sources was approaching $10,000 per month. And then something unexpected happened. A literary agent who specialized in educational publishing reached out. She had discovered Thomas's work through a recommendation from a teacher friend. She saw potential for his approach to reach a much wider audience through traditional publishing channels, specifically a series of graded readers for English learners that could be distributed to schools and libraries internationally. The opportunity was significant. It would mean working with professional editors, proper design and illustration, distribution through established channels that reached institutional buyers. But it also meant navigating the traditional publishing world, contracts, advances, royalties, timelines measured in years rather than weeks. Thomas took the meeting, then several more meetings. Eventually, he signed a deal for a series of 6 books, with the possibility of more if the first volumes performed well. The advance wasn't life-changing, but it was substantial enough to give him breathing room to reduce his teaching hours and focus more on content creation. But here's what's important to understand. That publishing deal, that external recognition and opportunity, only happened because Thomas had already spent 4 years building something real. The agent didn't discover potential, she discovered proven capability. Thomas had evidence. Tens of thousands of engaged learners demonstrated ability to create content consistently, a track record of work that people valued enough to pay for. The opportunity didn't create his success. It amplified success that already existed in a smaller, less visible form. This is the pattern that repeats across almost every meaningful achievement. The world notices after the work has already proven itself. Opportunities arrive after capability has already been demonstrated. Recognition comes after someone has already been laboring in relative obscurity, building something substantial enough to eventually demand attention. 6 months after signing the publishing deal, Thomas left his teaching position. By that point, his combined income from paid subscriptions, book sales, and the publishing advance exceeded his teaching salary. More importantly, he had built something that could scale. His content could reach unlimited learners without requiring his physical presence. The trajectory from obscure side project to sustainable primary income had taken nearly 5 years. 5 years of creating content weekly while working a full-time job. 5 years of slow, incremental growth. 5 years of working when nobody was particularly impressed by what he was building. But those 5 years weren't wasted. They were essential, because they allowed Thomas to develop genuine expertise in creating effective learning materials. They gave him time to refine his approach through continuous feedback and iteration. They built an audience organically, people who discovered his work because it was genuinely useful, not because of marketing manipulation, and crucially, those 5 years transformed Thomas himself. He went from being someone who had an idea about better language teaching methods to someone who had actually implemented those methods successfully at scale. He developed skills in content creation, community building, educational design, business fundamentals. He became the person capable of handling the opportunities that eventually arrived. This is perhaps the most important thing to understand about the journey from invisible to undeniable. The work changes you as much as it changes your circumstances. The process of persisting through obscurity, of continuing when results are minimal, of improving your craft without immediate reward, that process forges capabilities you simply cannot develop any other way. You cannot skip the invisible phase and arrive at the recognition phase as the same person. The struggle itself is what transforms you into someone worthy of the success you eventually achieve. I'm sharing these stories. Sophia's voice acting journey, James's furniture craftsmanship, Kenji's podcast production, Amara's sustainable fashion, Thomas's language learning materials. Not because they're extraordinary outliers. I'm sharing them because they represent a pattern that appears in almost every meaningful success story once you look past the polished final result. Every person who has built something significant went through a phase where the work was invisible, where progress felt impossibly slow, where support was minimal or absent, where doubt, both external and internal, suggested that continuing was foolish. And every person who eventually succeeded made the same fundamental choice. They continued anyway. Not because they had some special advantage or supernatural confidence, but because they had developed the capacity to keep building even when the evidence of progress was too small for anyone else to see. If you're currently in that invisible phase, working on something that matters to you but hasn't yet produced impressive results, I want you to understand something crucial. You're not behind. You're not failing. You're exactly where you need to be. The invisible phase is not a punishment you have to endure before earning success. It's the necessary construction period where you develop the skills, knowledge, resilience, and self-belief that will eventually support everything you achieve. Every hour you spend practicing your craft is building capability that didn't exist before. Every problem you solve is developing judgment you'll rely on later. Every moment you continue, despite discouragement, is strengthening the internal foundation that will sustain you through future challenges. The work you're doing now, even though it feels small, even though nobody's applauding, even though the results seem disproportionate to the effort, that work is not disappearing into a void. It's accumulating, compounding, preparing to cross a threshold where the invisible suddenly becomes undeniable. And when that moment arrives, when people start noticing what you've built, when opportunities begin appearing, when the skeptics who once questioned you start asking for advice, you'll discover something profound. Their recognition, while gratifying, is no longer the point, because by the time they see what you've accomplished, you've already become someone who doesn't need their validation to know your work has value. You've already proven it to yourself through years of consistent effort. You've already transformed from someone who dreams about achievement into someone who achieves. The external recognition is simply the world catching up to something you already knew. That your vision was worth pursuing, that your effort was creating something real, that the path, despite being lonely and uncertain, was leading somewhere meaningful. So if you find yourself struggling with the weight of working in obscurity, if you're questioning whether your effort matters when so few people seem to notice or care, remember this: every remarkable achievement begins exactly where you are now, with someone working quietly on something that doesn't look impressive yet, with someone continuing despite the absence of applause, with someone building foundations that nobody can see, but that will eventually support something undeniable. Your task right now is not to convince the world that your vision is valuable. Your task is to continue building it with enough consistency and commitment that eventually its value becomes impossible to ignore. Keep creating, keep improving, keep showing up. The invisible phase doesn't last forever, but the capabilities you develop during it, the resilience, the self-trust, the expertise, those become permanent parts of who you are. And when the moment finally arrives that your work crosses from invisible to undeniable, you'll be ready. Not just ready to receive the opportunities, but ready to be the person capable of maximizing them. Because the greatest success doesn't come from having the world believe in you from the beginning. It comes from developing the strength to believe in yourself when nobody else does, and then proving through relentless, patient, strategic effort that your belief was justified all along. The journey from alone to accomplished is not a straight line. It's not fast. It's not easy. But for those who persist through the lonely middle, who continue building when nobody's watching, who trust the process even when the results are delayed, the destination is not just success in the conventional sense. It's transformation into someone who no longer needs permission to pursue what matters, someone who generates their own belief through demonstrated capability, someone who has learned that the most important validation comes not from the crowd, but from the mirror. And that transformation, that internal revolution, is worth far more than any external achievement. Because once you become that person, the person who can succeed despite the absence of belief from others, there is no longer any limit to what you might accomplish. The world's doubt can no longer stop you. Your own doubt can no longer paralyze you. You've proven to yourself that you can build something meaningful from nothing, and that proof becomes the foundation for every remarkable thing you create afterward. So, wherever you are on this journey, whether you're just beginning and facing the first waves of skepticism, or deep in the invisible middle where progress feels maddeningly slow, or approaching the threshold where your work is about to become undeniable, remember this: you don't need everyone to believe in you. You don't even need anyone to believe in you, at least not at first. You only need the courage to continue building something meaningful, one day at a time, one small improvement at a time, until the work itself becomes so substantial that belief is no longer a question. It becomes an inevitability. And when you reach that point, when what once seemed impossible has become your everyday reality, you'll look back on this lonely beginning with a different understanding. It wasn't an obstacle to overcome. It was the forge that created you, the person capable of achieving what once seemed beyond reach. That person has always been inside you. The journey is simply the process of bringing them forward into the world, and it begins always with a single choice: to continue even when nobody believes you can, especially when nobody believes you can. Because the greatest successes in history have always belonged to those who learned to walk forward in the dark, building something they could see clearly even when the world around them saw nothing at all.